So today I'm doing a complete build on video. I've done this once before, but the quality didn't come out quite to what I would have liked. So I'm going to try doing it again and see if I can get a little bit higher quality video on this one. So this is going to be a decent mid-level gaming desktop. You can see all my parts here. Obviously I'll need a few other things, but this is the important stuff. This is going to be an i7-2600 with 16 gigs of RAM. We've got 16 gigs of, so I can get that there, good G-Skill rip jaws. I've got a matching kit of this, 4x4. I've got a fairly generic MSI branded, but fairly generic GTX760. Decent cooler, but it's a pretty common cooler. You see it on a lot of them. And then we have a good OCZ 750 watt power supply. This is a fairly beefy power supply. It's actually a lot more power supply than I normally would put on a system like this. However, I don't have anything else that would be sufficient. This would need at least a decent 550, and I am out of all the decent low-end power supplies, so this one's going to get a much higher-end power supply than normal. We have a pretty general Intel, I believe this is a, I think this is like a DQ67, something like that. I don't have the exact model in front of me, but with a i7-2600 processor on it. So let's get started here. The first thing I like to do with these builds, I always do what I call the pre-build. I like to use a nice motherboard box. I set it on the box, and I basically build the system right here on the box. The reason for doing this is my physical build process when I actually assemble the system usually takes at least an hour, sometimes more depending on the case and difficulties I encounter. And I like to actually make sure the parts work before I do that. And actually, before I even do that, so when I sell these systems, I like to actually take photos of all the components. A lot of sellers like to just post, one small grainy photo of the system, or they'll post photos of the parts, but what they'll do is they'll post like the generic photos from PC Parts Picker or something like that. And I find that buyers really appreciate having photos of their parts, like brand new parts. You know what brand new parts look like. I mean, that's not anything special, but this lets people see not what the parts look like new, but what they actually look like right now. So I usually photograph each individual component. Looks like we're going to be using Icy Diamond Thermal Compound today. And I didn't realize, but this one actually has a back plate on it. So the way these work, I get a lot of people who don't understand the way these work. So the way that these heat sinks work, show you here. So this will give you a good idea how to pull these off too if you've ever looked at one of these and wondered how to do this. So the way these work is they have two little things that move out like that, and the way they work is when you put the pin through them, they it holds them in, pushes it apart just like you can see there, and then you pull it out like that. It's no longer out, and you can pull it off the board. If the board is small enough, I do like physically picking up the board like this and supporting it underneath when I press these in. I don't think I've ever actually seen a board crack, but I'm always worried about it, so I like to be a little more careful with that. These boards for this chip socket are getting, it's still a good chip, but the boards are getting hard to find, so I never want to damage a board because the boards are basically, each board represents a buildable system. They're getting so rare now. Okay, so we've got that on. We set my power supply right here. And I always put this against the end of my table here, so I have my parts coming off the end right here. You can't really see it. Let's see if I can move the camera a little. There we go. So the ports are all going to come out over here where I'm waving my hand, just like if it were a built, ready-to-use system. Okay. So same thing here. Some of these are pretty tight. I like to support it underneath just to reduce the risk of damaging. See if I can move the camera again a little bit. There we go. That's a little better. Okay. Okay, so obviously first thing we do, once we get it all assembled, plug it in. Okay, so turn it on and see what we get. Okay, so we're looking good, everything booted. So, next step, add a drive. So this unit, I would normally do a 1 terabyte on a unit like this, but I don't actually have any 1 terabytes. I'm a little low on drives right now. So in order to make up the value difference for the buyer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with a 120 gig SSD. It's not anything fancy, but it's a good Samsung 840 EVO. And a 500 gig drive. So you've got a decent size. Usually once Windows is installed, 120 gig SSD is enough space for Windows, basic software, and one current generation reasonably high-end game. Because most of these newer games are bigger than 50 gigs now. I think most of the new ones, I've seen some as big as 80 or 90 gigs now. Okay, this is the second part of this build. So I just finished testing the parts. I ran about an hour of Titanfall 2 just to make sure everything was solid. Now I'm going to assemble the build. The case I chose for this is nothing particularly spectacular, but it's a decent case. It'll look decent. Never seems to matter with these gaming cases. When I sell the things, half the people that I talk to see it and think it's the coolest thing they've ever seen. Half the people see it and say, oh my god, that looks awful. This particular case does not have quite as much in the way of cable management capability, so realistically I'm going to have to get a little more creative on this one than I normally do, because there is literally nowhere to hide cabling. I guess if anybody watches through this and sees this part, let me know if anybody cares about this ridiculous cabling job I do, or if people could care less. Maybe people don't care. I don't know. I've always assumed people prefer these nicer built systems to something that looks dumb. Let's see here. Okay, gonna go with a Western Digital Blue 500 as the hard drive. I'm kind of a fan of the Western Digital Blue. Honestly, they really do exactly what they're supposed to do. They're a pretty much a decent middle ground between performance and price. And honestly, I probably test hundreds, if not thousands, of drives a year, and I can honestly say that I don't see a lot of dead Western Digital Blues. I see them, but I don't see a ton of them. So this is one trick I like to use to hide cables. Putting the hard drive down really low like this allows you to shove all the excess cabling underneath it. As long as it's a reasonably decent airflow case like this, you're not really going to have any problem with airflow as a result. This is worth mentioning. The SSD, I did switch to just a fairly standard Intel. I was having some issues with the Samsung. For whatever reason, I don't know if it was a BIOS incompatibility or what. They're both SATA 6 SSDs. It does happen though. But it was reading it. I was able to load Windows on it, but then the BIOS refused to boot to it. And in this case, I was able to drop a different drive in, and the different drive immediately worked. So it was one of those cases where, I mean, yeah, I could have spent a bunch of time troubleshooting it, but it really wasn't a good reason to do so. So in this case, I ended up just switching over to just a different drive. Let's see here. In this case, rather than screwing it in, I'm going to go with a double stick tape, foam tape. These SSDs don't generate a ton of heat, so you can get away with using something like this to attach it. Some people use super glue. I've done that in the past. I don't really like doing it anymore if I can avoid it. It's It works, but it comes out just a little bit tackier than I would like the systems to be. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to put it against the power supply and the bottom of the case. Like I said, these do not generate a lot of heat, but if for any reason there were some generated, this will keep it from degrading the double stick tape, because the whole weight of the drive will be resting against the bottom of the case. And this is actually going to work perfectly. And actually, this particular SSD has a little frame around it, which actually lets heat pass through with the way that that's set up on this particular one, which is kind of cool. I've never thought about that before. Ooh. I have never tried this before. That is perfect. So the way I'm going to do this, I received some computers a little while back that had these. They weren't part of any sort of backplate, which usually something like this will be, but it's this hard, both SATA and power in one. I'm going to actually run that. That'll make attaching and removing the SSD extremely convenient. So I'm going to run that like this. I was like messing around with something new, and that is definitely something new to try. Okay. So that'll go down in there. That is perfect. I really like that. Okay. Then we hide our cabling down in here. Once again, that comes out virtually perfect. Okay. looks like we are good. So the system powers on. So I don't appear to have had any parts failures as a result of the build process. Usually I like to put it together, turn it on with the original drive, and then when I'm attaching a second drive like this, I attach the second drive after the first time it's booted. I do like to use, especially in a black case with all black paint, I do like to use a black SATA cable when I run them through the case. So this one, for example, is going to go to the optical drive. And choosing a black SATA cable is just one more method of cabling perfection in my mind. This is kind of annoying. There's no real effective way with this build to hide all the cables. Some cases, and this actually isn't that bad of a case, but some cases, they just don't take cable management into account as well as some others. It's not even a question of price either. One of my favorite cases to build in as far as cable management is concerned is the Antec 300. The 300 and the 900 are supposed to be like the 300 is the low end and the 900 is the high end, but the 900, in my experience, has always had somewhat poor cable management. The 300 has awesome cable management, and in fact, I believe an Antec 300 would be a similar price level case to this one that I'm using. You know, a decent quality low-end case, which you're usually talking 50, 69.99, something like that for a decent quality case. It's not that it's a bad case, it's just some of these cases, apparently nobody thinks to go through and say, hey, somebody might want to hide all their cables. But it's not going to be awful. Once you've done enough of these, you figure out some creative ways to hide stuff that you might not have considered before. I think my biggest pet peeve is the fact that I don't know if you can really see it in here, but the smaller power connector doesn't have there's not a pass through up top, so I have to run the smaller power cable through the case here. You can kind of hide it by the video underneath the video card, but it will still not look quite as good as it would look if you actually had a pass through. kind of one of those things, once you've done enough of these builds, you say, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you put a 4-pin, 8-pin pass-through? Like, why would you not do that? Kind of that sort of thing. So that's kind of there's enough tension there to hold both of those in place. So that's one way to do it. It's actually kind of different. I've never done the PCI Express cable in that way, but it works. So we'll call it good. Ooh, and I can do that too. Or not. All in all, not that bad. That's what we're looking at right now. I can't see it. Move the camera here. Yeah, so it's not awful. It's just not perfect like I like them to be. Most people would say, "Oh my gosh, that looks great. What are you complaining about?" But that's what separates us perfectionists. Okay, so turn it back on again. Interesting. Okay, so everything's good. And we even have a decent back area here too. Sometimes the back looks absolutely atrocious, but this is actually comparatively not that bad. Let's do this. So we can get a Molex. I'm going to bet that this case probably has blue LEDs on the fan too, which, with the way this case is set up, actually might look really cool. Gosh darn it. Let's see. Get our Molex here. Yeah, it is indeed. Let's see that. So there's that nice blue glow in the front. And it's actually a nice quiet fan too. It's another one of my pet peeves. Nothing bugs me more than loud, annoying fans. Go grab another one. Got a number of these, big bulk load of these nice, kind of odd colored but decent Zigmatech fans a couple months back. Let's see if we can find ourselves a... Let's see if they're quiet enough first. Oh, yeah. Fans aren't filthy, but they have some dust on them. If you're building systems to sell, I always recommend wiping down all the fan blades and making sure that the entire system has minimal dust. It's not usually a deal breaker for people, but I find it's one less issue I have to overcome with buyers if I don't show up with dust-covered systems. If you do it right and you make sure everything's, clean and decent quality, typically the only question when you get out on site with the customer is the system what you advertised, and does it work as you advertised? I hate having to try to overcome particularly anything related to my own competence. And I always recommend wiping fans down, not blowing them out with compressed air, because compressed air only gets very, very light surface dust. Whereas if you want to get the anything that's caked on, even stuff doesn't even have to be caked on. Anything that's not like totally at the surface will not come off unless you actually wipe it off. Okay. So I always like to take a photo of the interior of the completed system. I find buyers like to see the interior, the exterior, and I have found as far as sales are concerned, once I started taking individual photos of each component, it definitely didn't hurt. I think the individual components, photos of the individual components, is a great way to show buyers that you're making no effort to hide anything at all. Especially since doing these videos and posting all the photos of the systems, people can compare what's in these photos and videos to what's actually in the system they receive. And make sure that it's the same hardware. Always recommend you remove any sort of sticker residue. Typically with gaming cases, people love attaching stickers to these things, so I would be surprised to receive a gaming case without any sort of sticker residue on it. It's a lot of that one. Lately, I've been finding that any sort of alcohol quite often works as well or better than, say, for example, Goo Off or stuff like that. Yeah, that's almost... Is it still on? There's still a little bit. Goo Off is a pain. If you've ever used that stuff, you know what I mean. That orange residue never goes away. Okay. So, there's our good, solid, completed system. Let me do a little interior photo video here. Get a little closer with the camera if I can. So, that is our final completed build. There you go. Anyway, I hope that was informative and of reasonably decent quality.